בהמשך to the sikha that we just heard, that the Rebbe told us, Tov Shel Lamed Ches, that we should increase in the learning of Hilchas Beis Hamikdash, Beis Abchira, Hilchas Geula. We have the honor today, Choshev in German, Harav HaChosid, Harav Chaim, Borch, הכהן, טיטלביום, and the Choshev Melamdim in Cheder is going to give us some insight into Hilchas Beis Abchira. Before this year, we know that the Rav of the Rebbe also should give Tzedakah B'tzibur. Everybody please, there's pushkas on the table, please give Tzedakah B'tzibur. Harav Chaim Borch, bevakasha.
Alright, the topic for today is going to be the Sha'arim of the Beis HaMikdash. How many gates were there to the Azara? First, started off learning Masechta Midas. The first Mishnah describes the different places where the Kohanim and the Leviim guarded. So it says, B'shleisha Mekayim es HaKohanim Shemrim, and it says where they would guard. Then it goes on to say how the Leviim guarded in Esrim ve'echad Makayim. And when describing the different places around the Beis HaMikdash where the Leviim would guard, it would say that there would be Chamisha al Chamisha Sha'arei Azara. So the assumption would be from this Mishnah that there was a total of 5 Sha'arei Azara, and all of those gates needed a Shomer. A Levi was standing by each of those 5 gates. Now, so that's the first impression you'll get when learning Masechta Midas, that there were 5 gates in total to the Azara of the Beis HaMikdash. You skip ahead to Mishnah Daled, 3 Mishnahs later. It says the Mishnah begins as follows: Shiva Sha'arim Hayu Ba'Azara, Shleisha B'Tzafein, Shleisha B'Darim, Ve'echad B'Mizrach. So right away you see a little bit of a stira. The Mishnah Zayin and Ches continue going on to saying all the names of the Sha'arim, what they would do by them. So the question is, if there were 7 gates, and we said before that there would be 5 Leviim, the Leviim would be guarding by 5 gates. How do these two Mishnahs match? Were there 5 gates or were there 7 gates? So we just started Masechta Midas, already confused. How many gates are there? So the Gemara asks this question, and the Gemara gives an answer. First, Abaye's opinion. Abaye says that there was 7 gates. And the first Mishnah that says that there were 5 gates holds that 2 of the gates don't need to have any shmirah. So again, L'Kula Alma, there were 7 gates. Mishnah Aleph says 5 out of 7 gates need to have shemrim. Mishnah Zayin says, Mishnah Dalet says, but in truth there were really 7 gates, not 5. That's the opinion of Abaye. Rava says, Machoikas. Ika Tana de Amar Shiva, Ika Tana de Amar Chamisha. So 2 opinions. One opinion holds that there were 5 gates, and one opinion holds that there were 7 gates. So it turns out that it's not really simple at all, whether it was 5 or 7. There's, first of all, 2 Mishnahs that don't say clearly how many there were. It seems to be a contradiction. And either you can fit them both together, say everyone agrees there were 7 gates, but just 2 of them didn't need to have any shemer by them, or you can say no, really there was 2 opinions here. One opinion holds you have 5 gates in total. The other opinion says there's actually 2 additional doorways in the Azara. There were 7 gates in total. Okay, that's Machlekes in Abaye and Rava. So now, generally speaking, we know you can't have a machlekes and a metzias. You got to come to a conclusion. How many gates were there in actuality? Was there 5 or 7? And Rava, which says that it's a machlekes, it's strange. How could you have a machlekes about such a fact? If there were 5, there has to be 5. If there are 5, 7, how could you have an argument about how many gates there were? So when you look in Rambam gives a psak din here. First, when the Rambam is talking about the shemrim, the Rambam says there were 5 shemrim by the 5 gates of the Azara. Seems like he holds that, like Rava's answer, that the first Mishnah holds there were only 5 gates. But then he continues and says, when he describes the different gates of the Beis HaMikdash, that there were 7 gates. So he does the same contradiction as what Rava learned in the Mishnah can't match together. It has to be 2 different opinions. The Rambam passes like each of those 2 Mishnahs. And then you might say that maybe the Rambam holds like the opinion of Abaye, that when he says 5 guards have to be by the 5 gates, therefore he only meant 5 out of the 7 gates. But we know that whenever there's a machlekes in Abaye and Rava, besides for 6 exceptions, Yal Kagan, what is the halacha? Machlekes Abaye and Rava, halacha is always like Rava. Again, besides for those exceptions. So here, we'll have to learn that the halacha is like Rava. Rava holds that there was a total of, there's a machlekes how many gates there were. Turns out there's a machlekes and mitzias, then there's a machlekes whether or not there's a machlekes and mitzias. So again, Rava says that there was 2 opinions. The Rambam holds like both of these opinions. How could that work? So the Rambam continues when he says that there were 7 gates, he says, and 2 of those 7 gates don't need to have any shemrim because there were kohanim guarding on Shar Beis HaNitzot and on one of the other Sharim, on the Shar Avtinas. So therefore, there didn't need to be 7 Leviim guarding by the 7 gates because kohanim were guarding by 2 of them. Okay, So the question is as follows. How could the Rambam, obviously when he says that there was 5 gates, he has to agree with Rava, there's really 7 gates. And he explains why he's saying that there were only 5 Levim guarding, because the Kohanim were guarding by the other 2 gates. So really there were 7 gates, and there were actually 7 places where there was Shemrim. No problem. We move on at the end of Mishnah Beis, at the end of Perek Beis, the last Mishnah of Perek Beis. Over there it describes how there were 13 places in the Beis HaMikdash where the Yidden, whenever they would pass by, they'd have to bow down. Sholish esrei shtachavayis. Where were they? So it says that they were on the 13. The 13 shtachavayis were at the 13 gates of the Azara. So the third opinion here. 1 second. Ushloish esrei shtachavayis hayisham abayesi ben Chanan Eimer keneged shloisha asar she'arim. He adds 1 gate on each side. He says instead of being 3, 3, and 1, a total of 7, he says there was 4, 4, 3, and 2. He says there was 4 on the Mizrach, on the Tzafan and Darim. There was by Shar Nikanor, there's an additional 2 on each side, so it makes it 3. And he says behind the Kedesh HaKadoshim there were 2 small gates there that didn't even have a name. So we see there was a total of 13 gates. So this makes the Machlokes and Metzias even more difficult to understand. Was there, how many gates were there? 5, 7, or 13 now? So before describing it, before answering how many gates there were, first you have to decide what's the definition of a sha'ar. So when you call something a sha'ar, it has to be that it has a halachic effect on it. There are certain dinim that apply only when there's a sha'ar, and different halachis when there's no sha'ar there. One example would be regarding shemrim. The Beis HaMikdash had to be guarded by all of its gates. So when you have an opening, you have to define it. Is it a gate or not? If it's defined as a gate, it needs a shemer. If not, it doesn't need a shemer. Another example would be, there's a pasuk that says, Al Yavei B'chol Eis El HaKadosh. The way the Torah describes not going into the Beis HaMikdash at any given time says Al Yavei. And the Gemara says whenever it says the term Bia, Derech Bia Asra Torah, that you have to enter in the usual way of entering. So it says if the person, let's say, would enter backwards, walking backwards, it's not Derech Bia, so he won't be tamei until he's entirely inside. If he goes and facing forward, then as soon as he's majority inside, he's already tamei. He's already over on the Avera. So that says the idea of entering derech bia is if you're going through a shar. The regular way to enter a house or enter a area is through the gate. So if there's an opening in the wall that's not a proper shar, then this halacha wouldn't apply. It wouldn't be considered derech bia. So therefore, when we're discussing how many sharim are there, we're discussing what sha'arim need to have a shemer by it. What sha'arim, when you enter through them, is it considered derech bia? Another question would be whether, what applies these days, whether a place needs a mezuzah or not. The Torah says, if it has the definition of a shar, you need to write a mezuzah. If it doesn't have the definition of a shar, it's potter from a mezuzah. Now, practically in the Beis HaMikdash, they didn't need to have any mezuzahs because there's a hekesh in the Gemara between the words beisacha uvisharecha. Just like a bayis is chayil, so too the shar has to be chayil. We exclude anything that's hekdesh, doesn't need a mezuzah. So, but if someone would make a replica of the Beis HaMikdash and they have the similar sized gateways, would such a gate be necessary to have a mezuzah? You have to see, does it have the criteria to be called a shar or not? So now, once we see these different halachas that are affected by whether something's a shar or not, we can learn that the way Rava learns that there was different opinions. One opinion says there was 5 sharm, one opinion says there was 7, and there's a third opinion later that says there were 13 sharm. It's not a machlekes and metzias. They're arguing about how to define these openings. The first opinion says there were 5 sha'arim. He holds there was only 5 gateways that had a definition of a sha'ar that shouldn't have a shmira. There's only 5 gateways that would have had to have a mezuzah if they would have been chal. There's 5 gateways that when you enter them, it's considered derech bia. The next opinion says no. Some of the other openings also were enough to be considered a sha'ar, and they were also required to have the same halachas. The third opinion, everyone agrees, doesn't need to have shmira. No one holds the need to have 13 shemrim. So even the one that says that there's 13 shtachavayis, he counts them as sha'arim. Those openings he counts as sha'arim only with regard to the need to bow down when you pass by any of those sha'arim, not for any of the other halachas. But we see that when we call it a sha'ar, it's when it has a halachic importance. So according to this, you could say the conclusion is that in truth, there was a total of 13 sha'arim according to all opinions, according to every Mishnah you learn. And even the way Rava learns it, and he says there's one man da'amar that says 5, and one man da'amar says 7, and one man da'amar says 13. They really all agree that there was really 13 sha'arim. The whole argument isn't about how many entrances and exits there were to the Beis HaMikdash. The argument was, watch, how many of these entrances do we give the definition of a sha'ar? How many of them are we going to call with the name sha'ar? According to the first Mishnah, he says that is a shita that holds there was only 5 such gates. The second shita holds there were 7 such gates. And then the last Mishnah in Parak Beis, at the end of Parak Beis, that says there were 13 gates. He says that since they would have to bow down by all of these 13 places to praise Hashem for the beauty of the Beis HaMikdash, therefore he calls it as if there were 13 gates. Because again, each of these places were significant enough to have a chiyuv to bow down in those places. So now, when we go back to the Rambam, when he says first that there was 5 Levim guarding, that means that there's Shmir by 5 of the gates. Then he says afterwards that there were really 7 Sha'arim. No, the Rambam agrees there were 13 Sha'arim. When he says that there were 7 Sha'arim, means that 7 places have a criteria of a Sha'ar. And one of the definitions of a Sha'ar is that it has a Chiyuv Shmira. How could you have only 5 Levim guarding when there's 7 openings that need to have a Shmira? He says Shiva Sha'arim. So therefore he has to answer that and says because the Kohanim were guarding by 2 out of the 7. 2 out of the 7 there had to be 7 gates with Kohanim guarding. And they were 7 places, there had to be 7 places where there was Shmira, and there was 7 places with Shmira. 5 in Mishnah Aleph from the Levim, and then another 2 that the Kohanim guarded as well. Now, based on this explanation, we have a question on Mishnah Daled. When it goes through Mishnah Daled, the different Sha'arim that there was in the Beis HaMikdash, it says, when it comes to Sha'ar Nitzot, it says as follows. Sorry, it's Mishnah Gimel. No, Mishnah Daled. Shabbat Tzafein Sha'ar Nitzot. And then the Mishnah goes on to describe a bit about how Sha'ar Nitzot looked. This is the first gateway on the northern side of the Beis HaMikdash. It says, Uchemin Achsadr Haya, the Aliyah Bnuya Al Gabav. It was like the Rav explains, it was like 2 walls on a roof, where the Kohanim Shemer Mil Mailon, the Halaviyim Mil Matan. Upesach Chayil Lachel. It had an opening in there that went towards the Chil. So it seems like there was one gateway called Sha'ar Nitzot, which had on it both Kohanim and Levim. According to the Rambam just answered, he said that there were 7 gates, 5 of them had Levim, and 2 of them had Kohanim. Then the two Sha'arim that had Kohanim should have been 2 additional Sha'arim, 2 separate places. But the Mishnah says clearly that Sha'ar Nitzot had both a Kohen and a Levi. The Rebbe asked this question in the footnote, and the Rebbe says, Yesh laharich b'kol zeh, ve'en kama koymi. That you're meant to speak about this on. So we're going to give an answer that's mentioned in different mafarshim. And it says over there, they take this Mishnah a little bit out of, not Kipshutei, but when they say over here that the Kohanim Shemer Mil Mailon, it's not referring to exclusively by this Sha'ar, but it means in general. Wherever the Kohanim were guarding, it was always on the top of the walls of the Azara. Wherever there were Levim guarding, Levim were always guarding on the floor, near the gateway. And therefore, it's not a contradiction. The Kohanim that were guarding Mil Mailon were not at the same gate where there were Levim. All the time, there were the Kohanim by some of the gates, Levim by other of the gates. And it turns out that according to Rava, the Chiddush is that even though, generally speaking, the guarding of the Sha'arim really belonged to the Levim. That was the Levim's job. The Kohanim, they were meant to guard in the batim, in houses. The way the Mishnah describes the place where the Kohanim should have been guarding, it says, the Beis Avtinas, Beis Hanitos, Beis Hamaykid. So they're not meant to be at the gates, they're meant to be in rooms. Just like Beis Hamaykid is a room, Beis Hanitos and Beis Avtinas should also been rooms. However, the Rambam says, since these rooms were on top of a gate, it's counted as both. They were Shemerim in a bias, but since they were next to a gate, they were Yaitza the Chayv of Shemir and that Sha'ar, and there was no need for there to be a Levi there. Comes Rava, that was all Rava, and that's the halacha that Rambam's learning. Abaye, however, learned that everyone agrees there were 7 gates. And he says, Rava says 7 gates, but he says there are 2 gates that didn't need to have Shemir altogether. And the reason why he says that, because he holds the Kohanim Shemir didn't count for the Sha'ar. And therefore he says those gates didn't count as a Sha'ar altogether. The reason why there's no Levi there is because it was not considered a gate in the first place. Now the reason, when the Rebbe said the Sichel is connected with the Miftzah Mezuzah. So oftentimes when a person's doing construction and they have different doorways and openings and they're making it different sizes, sometimes you have a chakira, is it a door, is it not a door, is it considered, how do you measure it, does it need a mezuzah, not need a mezuzah? So we see that this argument and this declare happened in the Beis HaMikdash. They were looking at each of the Sha'arim, everyone agrees and everyone knew how they looked. They were arguing, is this Sha'ar, would it be chayv in a mezuzah, doesn't it have a shaymer, or is it considered derech bia? And that's the whole machlokes over here between Abaye and Rava of whether or not there were many Sha'arim, whether fewer Sha'arim, or according to Rava, each of these Tanaim hold different opinions about how to define a Sha'ar. We know the famous question whether there will be Beis HaMikdash will come down from Shemaim, whether it will be built by Mashiach. And one of the answers given is that the Beis HaMikdash in general will come down from heaven, but the She'arim, which says Tavu be'ayat She'arah, the gates will be put on by Mashiach, and whoever puts on the doors completes the binyan is considered like he did the entire thing. So Hashem should help. We should have the She'arim of the Beis HaMikdash take of Yad Mamash.